She was still crying when the sky opened. The rain came down in curtains, heavy and cold, smashing against the ruins of what had been a market square 3 days ago. Now it was just rubble and ash and the smell of something burned that no one had come to name yet. Mara sat at the edge of a toppled fountain, shoulders folded in, hands pressed against her face, and she made no move to get out of the rain. She had nowhere to go. That was the truth of it. Nowhere and no one, and she was so tired of pretending otherwise that the rain almost felt like a kindness. The Verk ships had come at dusk on a Tuesday. That was the detail that kept ambushing her. Tuesday, like it was supposed to be ordinary. She had been closing up her father's repair shop when the first shadow passed over the sun, massive and silent, the kind of silence that sits in the chest and won't move. She remembered looking up and seeing the underbelly of the lead cruiser, pale gray, smooth as bone, moving with a slowness that made it worse somehow, like something that knew it didn't need to hurry. She remembered her father's voice saying her name. Then the sound came, a low vibration that passed through the ground and through her teeth and through the back of her eyes, and the windows of every building on the street blew inward at once. She had found him 3 hours later. She didn't cry then. She didn't cry when the Verk ground units swept through the quarter in their segmented shells, their translator drone speaking in flat, declarative tones about compliance and resource yield and the new civic structure. She didn't cry when she surrendered her family's ID registry at the checkpoint, or when the soldier, if that was even the word for something 8 feet tall and jointed like a praying mantis, scanned the back of her hand and assigned her a labor tier. She held herself very still through all of it, the way you hold yourself still when the thing happening is too large for your body to process, and all you can do is wait. She cried now because there was no one left to hold still for. The rain was getting harder. It bounced off the broken cobblestones and ran in little rivers through the char, and Mara sat in the middle of it with her face in her hands and let it come. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Her labor assignment started in the morning. She had nowhere to sleep that wasn't a floor and no blanket and one boot with a broken buckle, and she was 26 years old and alone in the rubble of everything she had ever known, and she just cried. Ugly and formless, and without any audience to perform grief for. That was when she heard the footsteps. Not human footsteps. She knew what those sounded like now. These were heavier, deliberate, each step placed with the kind of precision that spoke of something accustomed to making the ground acknowledge it. She lowered her hand slowly and turned her head. He stood at the edge of what remained of the square's colonnade, and he was watching her. She had heard the word sovereign before, but she had never expected to see one this close, and certainly not like this, alone, no escort, standing in the rain with his arms loosely at his sides and his dark cape catching the water in long streaming lines. The Verk sovereigns were the pinnacle of their caste system, not soldiers, not administrators, something higher and older than both. The other refugees in her labor block had whispered about them in the first days. Eyes like mirrors. Cold enough to freeze stone, the kind of thing you looked away from before it noticed you looking. She didn't look away. She was too tired to be afraid, or maybe fear had used itself up in the last 3 days, burned through its fuel and gone quiet. She just looked at him. Tall the way all the Verk were tall, but assembled differently from the soldiers, less segmented, more composed, the kind of stillness that wasn't tension but its opposite. His face was almost human in its proportions, but not quite, the angles slightly wrong, the eyes a pale silver that caught the ambient light of the burning city 2 kilometers west and threw it back. He wore no helmet. He was just standing there, in the rain, looking at her. "You are not sheltering," he said. His translator must have been internal, because his mouth moved but the words arrived in her ears perfectly shaped. No lag, no static. A flat statement. No particular accusation in it, just observation. "No," Mara said. She didn't say anything else. What was there to say to that? She turned back toward the ruined fountain and looked at the cracked basin where the water was gathering now, turning brown with ash. She heard him move. She heard him stop again, closer. "You are assigned to the Eastern Labor Tier," he said. "I reviewed the registry before I came through this sector. Your designation is M1147. She looked back at him. There was something strange in the fact that he knew that, in the fact that he'd read it, in the fact that he was here at all, alone, in a ruined market square in the rain, at whatever hour this was. "That's right," she said. "Your name is Mara Vasich." "That's right, too." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him take in the square with the same unhurried attention he seemed to apply to everything: the rubble, the ash trails, the thin stream of dirty water crossing the stones, her. His expression did not change, but something in the quality of his attention did, some small shift she couldn't name. "Why are you crying?" he said, not a question the way a human would ask it, more like a coordinate he was trying to locate. Mara looked at her hands. They were trembling slightly, she hadn't noticed until now. "Because my father is dead," she said, "and I have nowhere to go, and it's raining." Silence. The rain came down. Somewhere behind him, 2 kilometers west, something structural gave way, and the sky flickered orange for 3 seconds and went dark again. "Your kind does this," he said. "When the grief is too large, you make water with your eyes." It was such a strange thing to say that for a moment she almost laughed. Almost. "Yes," she said, "we do." He studied her for another long moment with those silver eyes that she could not read at all. Then he reached inside his cape and withdrew something, a flat panel, warm-edged, the Verk equivalent of a data slate, and he marked something on it with one long-fingered gesture. "You will not report to the Eastern Tier tomorrow," he said. She stared at him. "Your designation has been transferred," he said, "effective immediately." "Transferred where?" "To my household." The rain continued to fall. Mara sat very still. She was aware, distantly, that this was the moment a smarter person would calculate something: threat, opportunity, the geometry of what a Verk sovereign wanted with a human woman he'd found crying in the rain. She was too tired to calculate. She was too empty. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the rain came down between them and neither of them moved. "Why?" she said. He looked at her for a long time before he answered. When he did, his voice was the same, flat, precise, without inflection, but there was something underneath it she couldn't identify. "Because you are still here," he said. "When every other member of your species in this sector has taken cover, you are sitting in the open, in the rain, in the dark, and you are not afraid." "I'm afraid," Mara said. "Then you are something else as well." She didn't know what to say to that. He moved then, crossing the wet stones with that careful, deliberate step, and stopped in front of her. Up close he was more overwhelming than frightening, the sheer scale of him, the way he blocked the rain from hitting her, the strange, cool scent of him underneath the smell of wet stone and ash. He looked down at her with those silver eyes, and she looked back up at him, and something passed between them that she didn't have a name for, something that was not comfort and not threat, and not anything she had felt before. "From now on," he said quietly, "you are mine to protect." Mara held his gaze. Her hands had stopped trembling. "I'm not a piece of property," she said. Her voice was steady. She hadn't expected it to be. Something moved in his expression then, so small she might have imagined it, a flicker at the corners of those silver eyes. Not offense, something closer to interest. "No," he said, "you are not." His name was Sovereign Ka. She learned this the way she learned most things about him in those first weeks, indirectly, in pieces, the way you map something large by walking its edges. The household to which she had been transferred was not what she'd imagined when he used the word. She had pictured something cold, a holding facility with Verk aesthetics, hard angles and dim light. What she found instead was a working installation. A former civic building the sovereign had converted into a regional coordination center, humming with low activity at all hours, full of administrator caste Verk who moved quietly through their tasks and watched her with an evaluative curiosity that was less hostile than scientific. Her role was officially catalogued as cultural liaison. In practice, for the first several days, it meant sitting in a plain room with a Verk archivist who asked her questions for hours. Not interrogation, something more like documentation. What do humans eat? What is grief? What is the function of music? What is a name? The archivist was called Rethen, and she was small by Verk standards, and had the manner of someone who found everything interesting and nothing threatening. And after the third day, Mara found that she was not dreading the sessions. She saw Sovereign Ka rarely. He moved through the installation like weather, present and then not present, a pressure in the room that everyone registered without looking directly at. When she did see him, it was usually in the central hall, reviewing some stream of data she couldn't parse, or standing at the tall windows looking out at the city with an expression she had started to recognize as his version of thought. He never explained his decisions to the people around him. They simply accommodated them. He spoke to her directly 4 times in the first 2 weeks. Each time it was brief, precise, without social lubrication. The first time, "You are not eating enough." The second, "Rethen says you asked about the library archive. You have access." The third, "Are you cold at night?" The thermal regulators in this structure were calibrated for Verk physiology. The fourth, and this one she turned over in her mind for days afterward. He appeared in the archive room, where she had been sitting for 3 hours, reading everything she could find on Verk agricultural disruption of occupied zones, building a private ledger of everything that could be argued, contested, brought to some table somewhere if a table ever became available. He stood in the doorway and looked at what she was reading, and he said, "You are making a case." "Yes," she said. "For whom?" "For whoever will listen." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Continue," and left. She continued. The first time she understood that something was happening that she did not have a word for, it was 6 weeks in. The city outside had passed through its most violent reorganization and settled into something that was not peace but was not constant burning either, a kind of enforced stillness, the stillness of a thing that has been subdued. The Verk administrators were efficient in the way of an advancing weather system. They didn't hate the things they moved, they simply moved them. That lack of malice was almost worse than malice would have been. It offered nothing to push against. She pushed against it anyway. She had been working for 3 weeks on a proposal, a systematic argument against the current labor tier assignments, drawing on the Verk's own efficiency metrics to demonstrate that the assignments were generating psychological deterioration in the subject population that would reduce productive output within 18 months. She was not appealing to their compassion. She was appealing to their data. She had learned that much. The Verk were not cruel because they enjoyed cruelty. They were indifferent because nothing had yet made indifference costly. She brought it to Rethen first, who read it twice with the expression of someone encountering a new and interesting specimen, then said, "You understand that this will need to be approved at sovereign level." "Yes," Mara said. "You understand that Sovereign Ka does not typically receive proposals from." "I know what I am," Mara said. "Will you send it?" Rethen sent it. She did not hear anything for 4 days, and she was beginning to build a contingency when the summons came, not from an administrator, direct. A simple notation on her access panel, Sovereign Ka, main hall, 7th hour. He was already there when she arrived, standing at the long table in the center of the room with her proposal, laid out flat on the surface in front of him. She had printed it out because she thought the physical weight of it would communicate something. She stood across from him and waited. He did not speak for a long time. He read. She watched his eyes move across the pages with that same unhurried precision she had come to associate with everything he did, and she kept her face still and her breathing controlled and her hands loosely at her sides. "Your argument," he said finally, "rests on a projection." "Yes." "The projection assumes maintenance of current labor intensity. If intensity is reduced, the timeline changes. Reducing intensity also changes the data. I've modeled both scenarios on page 4. He turned to page 4. He studied it. The silence stretched. "You used our methodology," he said. "Yes." "This is not how your species typically makes arguments." "My species typically makes arguments to people who share their emotional frame of reference. I don't have that option." He looked up at her then, and the quality of his attention was different from any time before. Not the cataloging interest of the first weeks. Something more direct. Something that felt, against all probability, almost like respect. "The reduction protocol will take 3 months to implement," he said. "The assignment of Tier 3 labor to children under 12 is not defensible under our own resource efficiency guidelines. I have already flagged it." Mara stared at him. "You already?" "I have been waiting for someone in this installation to produce a coherent argument in the appropriate framework," he said. "I was waiting to see whether you would." She held herself very still. There was something rising in her chest that she did not want to name because it was too tangled: anger at the delay, relief at the outcome, and something else, something she recognized as the specific feeling of being known. "That's a manipulative thing to have done," she said. He tilted his head very slightly. "Yes." "You could have told me." "You would not have written the same document if you had known it was a test," he said. "You would have written what you thought I wanted. Instead, you wrote what was true." She looked at him across the table with her proposal spread between them, and she thought about the rain and the ruined square and him standing in the dark watching her. And she thought about the way some things couldn't be explained by the logic of either species, only by the strange gravity of one person recognizing another. "Don't do that again," she said. "I will try," he said, which she was learning was as close as Sovereign Ka ever came to a promise. 3 months passed. She tracked the labor reassignments through Rethen, cross-referencing the reports from the residential sectors with her own tallies. The implementation was slower than the protocol specified, hampered by mid-tier administrators who saw no reason to deviate from the original structure. She made a list of names. She brought the list to Sovereign Ka. He removed them from their positions within the week. She did not feel triumphant about it. She felt something more complicated, the awareness of what it meant that a single conversation with the right person could move more than 3 months of organized petition had moved, the awareness of what it cost that the right person was not one of her own. She said this to him one evening. She had not planned to. He had been reviewing something at the windows, and she had been in the same room working on a projected summary of residential sector recovery rates, and the thought just came out. "It bothers me," she said, "that you can do in a week what my people cannot do in years." He turned from the window. "It bothers you that I have power. It bothers me that I have to bring you my arguments instead of a council of my own people. It bothers me that the structure requires me to work through you." He was quiet for a moment. "Would you prefer I hadn't intervened in the square?" She thought about that honestly. "No," she said, "that's the part that bothers me more." He crossed the room slowly and stood near the table where she was working, looking down at the data she had spread out. He looked at it for a long moment, and then he said, without looking at her, "My kind do not have a word for what you are to me." The air in the room changed. Mara held very still. "What I am is a cultural liaison," she said carefully. "Yes," he said, "that is what the registry says." He looked at her then. "That is not what I mean." She met his eyes, those silver eyes that she had once thought unreadable and had since learned to read in small ways, the slight change in light that meant attention, the stillness that meant discomfort, the particular quality of focus that meant something was being felt that he had no language for. "Sovereign Ka," she said, "you should be careful." "I am always careful," he said. "I mean about this." "I know what you mean. I'm a human woman from a conquered sector." "You are also," he said, "the only person in this installation who argues with me. That can't possibly be enough." "You would be surprised," he said. "What is enough after a very long time?" She looked at him for a moment. Outside, the city made its nighttime sounds, reconstruction machinery, the distant low hum of Verk patrol routes, and underneath both of those, just barely audible, the sound of people going about the small, survivable details of their lives. "I'm still building a case," she said. "For the council, if a council ever exists, I need you to know that I won't stop." "I know," he said. "It may be a case against policies you support." "I know that too. And you're fine with that." He looked at her for a long moment, and in his silver eyes she saw something she recognized now with a certainty that made her throat ache. He said, "I have been waiting for your species to give me a reason to look at you as something other than a resource problem. You give me reasons every day. Continue." The 4th month was when everything changed. There was a faction. There was always a faction. She had known about it in the abstract, a block of mid-caste Verk commanders who had watched Sovereign Ka's adjustments to the occupation model with the specific disapproval of people who believe efficiency and severity are the same thing. They had sent representations to the upper administrative structure. They had been denied. They were not finished. She found out about the plan not through any channel she was supposed to have access to but through Rethen, who came to her workroom very early one morning with the precise expression of someone delivering news they find both important and personally distressing. "There is a motion," Rethen said, "to reassign the sovereign." Mara looked up from the summary she was writing. "On what grounds?" "Operational misalignment, which is the formal term for." "For what?" "For the argument that his adjustments to the occupation model have been influenced by something other than command objectives." Rethen paused. "The specific influence named in the motion is the cultural liaison." Mara set down her stylus. She looked at the wall for a moment. Then she said, "When?" "The review is in 11 days. If the motion passes, the sovereign is withdrawn. The replacement will not share his," Rethen seemed to search for the right word, "philosophy." "No," Mara agreed, "he won't." She sat still for a long moment after Rethen left. She looked at what she had built in the last 4 months, the labor reform documents, the residential recovery projections, the list of administrators removed, the growing archive of arguments she was constructing with the patience of someone building something that was meant to outlast the moment. She thought about the children reassigned out of the Tier 3 labor pool. She thought about the old man in Sector 7 who had come to the coordination center with a grievance about water allocation and left with an adjustment, a thing that 3 weeks earlier would have been unthinkable. She thought about the ruined fountain and the rain and the cold ground under her boots. Then she started writing. She worked for 6 days straight, sleeping in short intervals, eating whatever Rethen left on her table. She produced 47 pages of formal documentation in the Verk administrative framework, a comprehensive analysis of the occupation model as revised over the past 4 months, with projections of resource yield, stability metrics, and population compliance rates compared against the original implementation. She drew on every methodology she had absorbed from 4 months of sitting in archives and review sessions, and quiet conversations with an archivist who found everything interesting and nothing threatening. She argued the case not on human terms but on their terms, not for mercy but for results. She argued that what Sovereign Ka had built here was working, that it was working because of what he had allowed to happen, that the thing being called a liability was in fact the mechanism. She brought it to him on the 7th day. He read it in silence. When he finished, he looked at her across the table with an expression she had never seen on him before, something vast and quiet, like a landscape after weather. "You are defending me to my own counsel," he said. "I'm defending the model," she said. "You're part of the model." "Mara, don't make it something it doesn't need to be." "It is already something," he said quietly, "whether or not we name it." She held his gaze. Her heart was doing something unsteady. She made herself breathe through it. "Submit the document," she said. "That's all I'm asking." He submitted the document. She was not permitted in the review hall. She waited in the archive room for 7 hours, working on other things with the surface of her mind while the rest of her just waited. Rethen came to find her when it was done. The motion had failed. Not narrowly. It had failed because the data had been unambiguous, because the metrics were their metrics, and the projections were grounded in their own operational standards, and because one human woman had learned to speak in their language well enough to build a case they could not dismiss. Sovereign Ka's position was confirmed. The replacement was stood down. When he came to find her, she was still in the archive room. She had not moved since Rethen left. She was sitting at the long table with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes on the middle distance, and the feeling inside her was not triumph, not relief, but something quieter and harder to carry, the knowledge that she had just committed herself to something she had been circling for months. He stood in the doorway the way he had once stood at the edge of the ruined square, watching her. "The document you wrote," he said. "The council is requesting a permanent version for the operational archives." "Fine," she said. "It will be catalogued under your name." She looked at him. "Mara Vasich," he said, "that is what I intend to tell them." She felt something shift inside her, not breaking, the opposite, something settling into a configuration she hadn't known she was trying to reach. "I want ongoing consultation rights," she said. "Not just within this installation, regional. Any policy change that affects the civilian population, I want to see the draft before it's implemented." "Yes," he said. "And a formal structure, not just me. Other designated liaisons from each sector, with real access, not ceremonial access." "I will propose it." "That's not." "I will implement it," he said, and she heard the difference. She nodded. She looked down at her hands on the table. Then she looked back up at him, at the silver eyes and the careful stillness, and the 7 weeks of knowing built up between them like sediment. "The first time you saw me," she said, "I was crying in the rain." "Yes." "That's not. I want you to know that's not who I am all the time." "I know," he said. "I know exactly who you are." She held his gaze. The archive room was quiet around them. Through the tall windows the city showed its nighttime face. Reconstruction lights, the glow of 10,000 small lives resuming their shapes in the aftermath. The long, slow work of a world that had been broken learning to be something else. "I'm going to keep arguing with you," she said. "Good," he said. "I'm going to be difficult." "You already are. I find it." He paused in the way she had learned meant he was searching for the right word in a language that didn't have the right word. Clarifying. She almost smiled. She didn't quite. "Sovereign Ka." "Yes." "Whatever this is," she said, "it has to mean something for my people, not just for me." He looked at her for a long moment, and what she saw in his face was not the silver evaluation of the first weeks. It was something she recognized, the specific expression of a person who has been shown something they did not know they were capable of seeing. "It already does," he said. "You have made it so." She held that for a moment, then she said, "I still want the council." "I know." "And the regional consultation structure." "I know." "And I want Rethen promoted. She's been essential and nobody's formalized it." "Done," he said. "And Mara," his voice was quieter, still precise, still without the emotional infrastructure her species ran on, but underneath it something else, something that moved through her the way the rain had in that first night, cold and real and impossible to ignore. "Whatever else you need," he said, "ask." She looked at him across the room. She thought about the fountain and the ash and the sound of her own grief in an empty square. She thought about 47 pages of argument and a council that had read them and found them sufficient. She thought about what it meant that a creature from the other end of the known universe had stood in the rain watching her and decided that what he was seeing was worth protecting. She thought about all the arguments still left to make. "I will," she said. That was where the story should have settled, into something recognizable, a new architecture of coexistence built on data and stubbornness, and the gradual, improbable work of two people learning the shape of each other across an impossible distance. That was the version she told herself in the months that followed, the version that let her sleep. But the war moved. There was a secondary command structure she hadn't known about, operating outside Sovereign Ka's authority, an older order within the Verk hierarchy that predated the current conquest protocol by 3 generations, and considered the current sovereign's methods a contamination of something pure. They did not make motions. They did not use councils. They sent a fleet to the Eastern Hemisphere, 3 weeks before the regional consultation structure was formalized, and they burned 7 cities to the bedrock in 72 hours, and they declared it a recalibration. Mara found out on a Wednesday. Of course it was a Wednesday. She stood in the coordination center with Rethen and 2 of the sector representatives she had been training, and they looked at the data together. The silence between them, the specific silence of people in the first seconds of understanding what they're looking at. "How many?" she said. Rethen told her. She sat down. She had not sat down involuntarily since the fountain. She let herself sit. She breathed for a moment. Then she stood back up. "Get me every operational record from the eastern sectors for the last 6 months," she said, "and get me Sovereign Ka." He was already in the hall when she came through the door, and his face told her what she already knew. He had not ordered this. He had not known. He looked at her with those silver eyes that she could read now, and what she saw in them was something she had never seen there before. Not the controlled blankness of command, not the careful attention of someone cataloging a new phenomenon. Something rawer, something that had not been designed into his species any more than it had been designed into hers. "Tell me you can stop them," she said. "I am working on it. Tell me you can stop them." "Mara, I need to know," she said, "whether the thing we have been building has any structural integrity or whether it is decoration." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "It has integrity. Whether it has sufficient weight to stop a secondary command structure is not yet determined." She held that, she breathed through it. "Then we make it heavier," she said. She worked for 3 days without stopping, and this time Sovereign Ka worked beside her. She had never seen him like this, not the careful sovereign moving through his installation like weather, but someone rolled up inside a problem, someone applying the full force of whatever he was to the specific question of how you build something too large to be ignored. He was terrifying like that, efficient in a way that made her own efficiency feel like a sketch. But he stopped and listened every time she interrupted, and he changed course twice when she showed him he was wrong, and she understood on the second night, watching him revise a structural argument based on her challenge, that this was what he had been looking for in the square, not her grief. What was behind it, the thing that had kept her sitting in the open in the rain? The document they produced together was not 47 pages. It was 212. It drew on human political theory and Verk operational doctrine, and 3 months of regional consultation records, and 30 years of conquest model data that Mara had not known she would ever need when she had been archiving it, quiet and methodical, in the months before. It made the argument not in the language of mercy and not in the language of pure efficiency, but in a third language they had built together in the preceding months. The language of what actually works, grounded in evidence, immune to abstraction. They presented it to the Upper Administrative Council on a Thursday morning. Mara stood before an assembly of beings none of whom were her species, and none of whom had ever been asked to take a human seriously as an operational peer. And she spoke for 40 minutes in their framework with their methodology citing their own data, and she did not look away from any of them, and her hands were still. It was not fast. It was not clean. The secondary command structure did not dissolve because of a document. It contracted and renegotiated its position over the following months, ceding some ground and holding other ground, the way things do when they have been built over 3 generations and don't know how to not exist. But the Eastern campaign halted. The recalibration was classified as an aberration. The regional consultation structure was formalized across every occupied territory. None of this was declared a human victory. Mara did not need it to be. She sat with Rethen on the evening after the council session in the archive room and drank something the archivist had produced that tasted nothing like coffee, but performed the same social function. And she looked at the city outside and felt the specific exhaustion of having poured everything you had into a moment that did not resolve the way moments in stories resolved, but was real and was hers. You could have been anything, Rethen said, which was the highest compliment in the Verk lexicon, a recognition that you had not been determined by your circumstances. I'm exactly what I am, Mara said. Rethen considered this. Yes, she said finally, that is what I mean. Sovereign Ka found her later that night. He always did, eventually. She was at the windows in the hall where she had stood the night she had told him she was still building a case, and the city below was lit up with the slow, patient light of its own survival, reconstruction lamps and window glow, and the distant flicker of something being made or something had been taken apart. He stood beside her, and they looked at it together for a while. The consultation framework passes to permanent status next week, he said. I know. Your designation and the registry will need to be updated. To what? I have been considering the appropriate term, he said. In your language or mine, there is not a precise equivalent for what you are. Try mine, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, council, representative, the word that means the person the sovereign listens to. Advisor, she said. Advisor, he repeated. He seemed to test the weight of it. It's a start, she said. He looked at her then, and she looked back at him, and the city went on below them, making its small, insistent sounds of continuance. She thought about the rain. She thought about the 47 pages and the 212 pages and all the pages still ahead of her, which she would write in full, one argument at a time, in whatever language they required. She thought about what it meant that the species that had come out of the sky and broken everything she had known had also sent this one particular creature to stand in her ruined square, and that creature had watched her sit in the rain and decided she was not a resource problem. She thought about what it meant that she had looked back. I'm still going to argue with you, she said. I depend on it, he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked back at the city. Outside, 7,000 humans were eating dinner, or trying to sleep, or telling their children something that might be true, or sitting in the ruins of things they had loved and trying to figure out what came next. They did not know her name. They did not know about the 212 pages or the secondary command structure or the formal consultation framework that would go into effect next week. They knew only that the quality of the pressure had changed, that something had shifted slightly in the structure of what was being done to them, that the grinding had not stopped but had altered its pitch. It was not enough. It was the beginning of enough. Mara Vasich, cultural liaison, advisor to the sovereign of the Eastern Occupation Zone, daughter of a man who had fixed things for a living, stood at a window above a broken and surviving city and looked at the work still ahead of her and did not flinch. She had been crying in the rain the night she had started. She was not crying now. The weeks that followed the council session moved differently than the weeks before. Not faster or slower exactly, but with a different quality. The quality of things that have found their footing and are trying to stay in it. Mara spent 3 of those weeks traveling between sectors, which meant riding in Verk transit vehicles through the altered landscapes of what had been her world, watching through scratched windows as the cities reshuffled themselves around the new architecture. She kept a journal. She had always kept a journal, a habit from her father who believed that the act of writing made things more real, more accountable to themselves. After the invasion, she had stopped for a while because the real had become too heavy to invite more of it onto paper. She had started again the week she moved into the installation. Now she filled it with things she couldn't put in formal documents. The face of a sector representative named Doris, who had been a schoolteacher before, and who listened to the regional consultation briefings with the careful expression of someone who had decided to keep all of her capacity available for exactly this purpose. The way a Verk mid-administrator called Velsoth had looked at her presentation and then, slowly, produced a stylus and made a notation in the margin of his own data slate, voluntary notation, her argument landing somewhere and changing something, and how that small gesture had sat in her chest for 2 days. The question a 12-year-old boy had asked her in Sector 4, pulled out of Tier 3 labor by the reform she had argued into existence, who wanted to know if the school buildings were going to be reopened, and if she could find out. She wrote down the question. She was going to find out. She came back from the sector tour on a rainy afternoon. Of course it was raining. She had begun to suspect the sky had a sense of narrative. And Rethen met her in the entrance hall with the expression of someone who has been waiting with news and has organized it for delivery. 3 things, Rethen said. Tell me. The eastern sectors have formally ratified the consultation framework. 11 sector representatives have registered their designations. Mara breathed. And the secondary command structure has withdrawn its operational claim to 4 of the 7 contested territories. Sovereign Khan negotiated it in your absence. Of course he did. She felt something warm and complicated about that. He hadn't waited, he had just worked. And the third. Rethen's expression shifted in the small way Mara had learned to recognize as something personal rather than administrative. The boy from Sector 4, the one who asked about the schools. Yes. His mother submitted a formal request to the consultation office. She has a teaching qualification. She wants to know if there is a process for resuming educational function in the sector. Mara stood very still for a moment. Tell her yes, she said. Tell her to come in, and we will build the process together. Rethen nodded and made a notation, and the look on her face was the look Mara had come to understand, was the Verk equivalent of moved. That evening Sovereign Ka found her in the archive room, which was where he always found her because it was where she always was. He came in quietly and stood in the doorway, and she looked up from the summary she was drafting, and they regarded each other for a moment in the way they had been regarding each other for months, the accumulated weight of everything they had built sitting between them like furniture, present, functional, impossible to pretend wasn't there. The sector tour, he said. Productive. I have detailed notes. I would expect nothing less. He moved into the room and stood beside the long table, looking at the spread of her work. The school question. She glanced up. You heard about that. Rethen tells me everything that concerns you. Does she? She considers it her operational responsibility. Mara considered this. I'm going to need a budget line for educational infrastructure restoration, she said. It's not in the current allocation model. I'm going to make the argument for it in the next review. I have already allocated it, he said. She looked at him. I was waiting, he said, to see if you would ask. You were doing it again. Yes, he said, I find that I cannot help it. You argue better when you don't know the answer is already yes. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, I'm going to figure out a way to make you stop doing that. Probably, he agreed. I look forward to seeing how. She looked back down at her documents, and he remained standing at the edge of the table, and the room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when two people are comfortable enough with each other to not require noise. The rain fell against the windows. The city made its nighttime sounds. Sovereign Ka, she said. Yes. The secondary command structure, it's not finished. No. It's contracting, not dissolving. Yes. Which means it will expand again eventually. Probably. She was quiet for a moment. What do we do about that? He was quiet too, which meant he was thinking about it honestly rather than performing an answer. She had learned to tell the difference. Finally, he said, we make what we are building so structurally embedded in the operational record that removing it becomes more costly than maintaining it. She looked at him. That's my strategy, she said. Yes, he said. You're using my strategy. You developed an effective strategy, he said. It would be inefficient not to use it. She almost smiled. She was getting better at not quite smiling. Fine, she said. Then we need 12 more sectors enrolled in the consultation framework before the end of the quarter. And we need formal documentation of every outcome attributable to the framework, measurable outcomes, resource metrics, exactly the kind of data that makes removal look like self-sabotage. I can have the documentation structure built by end of week. And I need 3 more human liaisons trained up. I can't be the only one who knows how to do this in their language. We need redundancy. Names, he asked. Doris from Sector 9, for one. A man called Hector from Sector 2 who used to work in urban planning and who I have watched absorb the operational methodology faster than anyone I've seen. And a woman from Sector 6 named Priya who I have not spoken to yet, but who submitted a consultation record last week that was more precisely argued than anything I produced in my first month. He took out his data slate and notated without comment. They'll need security of designation, she said. Formal status, not provisional. Done. And Rethen's promotion. Also done last week. She looked at him. You're very efficient when you've already decided something. Yes, he said. It's slightly infuriating. I know, he said. You are also slightly infuriating. I have come to value the sensation. The room was quiet again. Outside, the rain was beginning to ease. The city shifted in its nighttime rhythm, the sounds of a world that had been remade and was learning its new shape, not without grief, not without loss, but with the stubborn ongoing persistence that was, she was increasingly certain, the single most human thing there was. She thought about her father. She thought about his repair shop and the way he had touched broken things carefully, with full attention, as if each broken thing was worth the care. She thought about the fact that she was doing the same thing now, in a different register, with a different set of tools, in a world he had not lived to see repairable. She thought that he would have had something useful to say about all of it, probably something very short, probably delivered while looking at something else. She thought about what he would have made of Sovereign Ka. He would have watched you for a while, she said aloud, without really meaning to. Sovereign Ka looked at her. Who? My father. She looked at the window. He would have watched you, and then he would have asked you a question that seemed simple and wasn't, and then he would have gone back to work. The sovereign was quiet for a moment. What question? I don't know, she said. I would have had to have known what he'd seen in you first. She felt Sovereign Ka's attention settle on her with its full weight, the way it had in the square that first night. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the window, on the city, on the rain slackening to nothing against the glass. "What do you see?" he said quietly. "Not what do your father see, what do you?" She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the last of the rain stopped, and the city's lights reflected clean and bright off the wet streets below. "I see someone who looked at a broken thing," she said at last, "and decided it was worth the care." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. She turned her head and found him watching her with an expression that had no Verk name and possibly no human name either, something past category, something that lived in the space where one world's edges met another's, and neither quite knew what to call the border. She held his gaze, she didn't look away. "So did you," he said. She thought, yes, she thought that's the whole of it, isn't it? Two people who looked at a broken thing and decided. One from a ruined square in the rain. One from wherever he had come from, carrying whatever he carried, arriving in a city he had helped destroy and finding there a woman who was still sitting in the open and still choosing not to be done. "Yes," she said, "I suppose I did." They stood on opposite sides of the table in the archive room with all of it between them. The documents and the data and the formal consultation framework, and the 12 more sectors still to enroll, and the 3 new liaisons still to train, and the boy from Sector 4 who wanted his school back, and the woman with a teaching qualification waiting to build a process together. All of it real, all of it built from nothing, all of it hers. She was 26 years old and she had nowhere left to go, and it was no longer raining. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. There was a morning, 3 months after the council session, when Mara woke before dawn and lay in the dark of her room in the installation, and did something she hadn't done in a long time. She took a full accounting. This was something her father had taught her, not through instruction but through watching. She had seen him do it at the end of difficult days, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea he didn't always drink, just sitting, looking at nothing in particular with the focused inward expression of a person going through a list. When she was young, she had asked what he was doing. He had said, checking what still holds. She did it now. The eastern sectors. 11 sector representatives registered, 3 more pending designation. Doris from Sector 9 had been in the training sessions for 2 weeks and was already producing consultation records sharper than most of what Mara had submitted in her second month. Hector from Sector 2 had taken the operational methodology and extended it in 2 directions Mara hadn't thought of, applying it to infrastructure allocation in a way that was going to make the next budget review considerably more useful. Priya from Sector 6 had submitted 4 consultation records in 3 weeks, and every one of them was clean, precise, grounded in the kind of evidence that built real cases. Mara had read the last one twice, not to check it, but because it was good, and reading something good was its own reward. The school in Sector 4 was operational. Small still, operating out of 2 rooms of a building that had been a community center, but operational, real. 6 teachers who had been doing other labor because there had been no other option now back in the rooms they had trained for. Mara had been to see it. She had stood in the doorway of the main room on the second day and watched a class of 14 children, some of them barely old enough to remember what school was supposed to feel like, working through basic exercises with the focused intensity of people who understood that this moment had been fought for. She had not cried. She had thought about crying, and then decided she was saving it for something else. The educational infrastructure allocation had gone into the formal budget with a line item designation and her name on the proposal. Sovereign Ka had said nothing about that. She suspected he had done it deliberately and was waiting to see if she noticed. She had noticed. She was not going to tell him. The secondary command structure was quiet. That was the word she used in her own mind and in her documents. Quiet. Not gone. Not defeated. Quiet the way something is quiet when it has recalculated its options and is waiting for a better angle. She was watching for the angle. She had a list of indicators, a set of signals she had assembled from 4 months of reading every operational record she could access, and she reviewed the list once a week. Nothing had moved yet. She expected something would move eventually, and she was trying to be ready before it did. That was the other thing her father had taught her. Not through instruction. Through watching him in the shop, the way he handled a job he knew was going to be complicated, not dreading it, not pretending it wouldn't be complicated, just preparing for it with the patient, methodical attention of someone who trusted that preparation was more useful than worry. She trusted that. She lay in the dark of her room and checked what still held and found that it held. Not perfectly, not without cost, but solidly, the way things hold that have been built to hold rather than to look like they hold. The important difference. The one her father had cared about most. She got up before sunrise and made tea. She had found a kettle and a tin of something that approximated what she had grown up drinking, and the approximation was both wrong and sufficient. And she sat in the archive room in the early quiet and worked. Rethen came in an hour later with her own version of morning tea, and the expression of someone who finds the sight of another person, already working at dawn, both admirable and slightly concerning. "You know you're allowed to sleep past sunrise," Rethen said. "I know," Mara said. Sovereign Kai was in the central hall until the 4th hour. "I know that too." Rethen settled into her own chair, and for a while they worked in parallel in the easy silence of people who have been in the same room for enough mornings that silence between them is comfortable. The installation woke up around them in degrees, the first shift of administrators beginning to move through the corridors, the low background hum of the data systems cycling through their daily refresh, the sound of the city outside becoming audible through the high windows as it shifted from nighttime to daytime rhythms. "The Sector 4 school submitted a formal report," Rethen said, not looking up from her work. "They have 12 additional students who were not in the initial enrollment. Families who heard it was open and came." Mara held that for a moment. 12, she said. "The teacher Doris equivalent in that sector, a woman called Sarah, requests a 3rd room. She gets a 3rd room. I'll note that. Note it as approved, not pending." Rethen made the notation. "Also," she said, still not looking up, "Priya from Sector 6 has requested a meeting. She says she has a proposal." Mara looked up. "What proposal?" "She didn't specify. She said she wanted to present it directly." Rethen glanced at her. "She has the expression, when she says it, of someone who has been working on something for a while." Mara felt something that she recognized as the specific pleasure of someone who has planted a thing and is watching it grow in a direction she didn't plan. She had given Priya the framework, the methodology, the access. She had not told her what to do with it. Priya had apparently decided for herself. "Schedule the meeting," Mara said. Priya's proposal was for a cross-sector communication network, a formal channel through which the designated human liaisons could exchange consultation records, flag emerging issues, and build a shared body of precedent. Not a resistance cell, not an underground, formal, documented, operating entirely within the consultation framework, using Werk methodology to do exactly what Werk methodology was designed to prevent human communities from doing, which was coordinating. Mara read the proposal twice. Then she looked at Priya, who was watching her with the calm expression of someone who has run the numbers and knows what they say. "You understand," Mara said, "that this will require sovereign approval." "Yes," Priya said. "Do you think we'll get it?" Mara thought about Sovereign Ka reading her labor reform document and saying you used our methodology. She thought about him allocating the educational infrastructure budget before she asked. She thought about him standing in the rain in a ruined square watching a woman cry and deciding she was worth protecting. She thought about what it had taken to get there, what had been built from that moment, what was still being built. "Yes," she said. She was right. The cross-sector network formalized in the same quarter as the educational infrastructure expansion, and the enrollment of the 14th sector representative, and the quiet but significant recalculation of the secondary command structure, which adjusted its operational posture for the third time when the consultation framework's first annual report was released, and the outcome metrics were, by every measure, undeniable. Mara presented that report herself. She stood before the Upper Administrative Council for the second time, in the same hall where she had stood 11 months earlier with 212 pages in her hand still, and she presented the data of 1 year of the consultation framework operating in the Eastern Occupation Zone: resource efficiency, population compliance, reduction in active resistance incidents, education recovery rates, healthcare infrastructure restoration velocity, 12 human liaisons, 14 sectors enrolled, 43 formal outcome metrics showing positive trajectory. She didn't argue this time. There was nothing to argue. She just presented the evidence and let it hold its own weight. Sovereign Ka was in the hall. He always was when she was presenting. She had stopped finding this unusual. He stood at the far edge of the assembly, not at the table, slightly apart from the other administrative presences, watching. When she finished, and the council's review period began, she found his eyes across the room and held them for a moment. He inclined his head, very slightly, not a bow, an acknowledgement, the specific gesture of one person recognizing another as an equal. She went back to the archive room and continued building the case for the next year. She understood now that this was what it was going to be, not a single victory, not a resolution that arrived and declared itself finished, a direction. A long, continuous work of making the case in whatever language they required, adapting to the shifting architecture of what was possible, finding the arguments that were too embedded to dismiss, and making those arguments until they became structural, until they became precedent, until they became the way things were done. She understood that her father had been doing this his whole life, not in occupied territory, not in a building full of creatures from the other end of the universe. In his repair shop, one broken thing at a time with whatever tools were available, without drama and without despair and without stopping. She understood that she was his daughter. The rain came again on the last night of the first year, since the Werk ships had arrived at dusk on a Tuesday. She heard it before she saw it, a sound against the windows of the archive room like something being said that she almost understood. She set down her stylus and looked out. It was coming down the same as that first night, heavy and cold, the kind of rain that doesn't apologize. She thought about going downstairs and standing in it. She didn't. She picked up her stylus and went back to work. There would be time for rain later. There was always more rain. Right now, there were 12 more sectors to enroll. She wrote the first line of the proposal and did not stop.